Before we get into tonight's spooky urban legends, I just want to do a disclosure that there are talks about suicide and domestic violence in this episode, so viewer discretion is advised. Valentine's Day is supposed to be about affection, closeness, and reassurance. It's also a day when people tend to lower their guard. They give in to love and fantasies, and they welcome tenderness and expect kindness. And that's why so many urban legends wrap their horrors up neatly in a heart-shaped box. Some stories blur the line between reality and the unfamiliar. They whisper in the night, waiting to be heard. So let's listen. Let's talk spooky. Welcome back, spooky souls, to our Valentine's Day bonus episode. I promised that I would be giving you guys a bonus episode, and I thought Valentine's Day would be the perfect time, because it's a time when the world feels a little louder than usual. It's full of hearts and store windows, love songs on repeat, and a reminder that romance is everywhere you turn. And it even gives hope to those who might not have found their love yet. But tonight, we're not going to sing the ballad of love. No, we're going to step away from the sweetness, because long before Valentine's Day became about the chocolate and handwritten love notes, it was tangled in something far less comforting, something sinister, something vulnerable, and the quiet fear that comes with wanting to be seen, but realizing you might be watched. And we know urban legends love nights like this, nights when people lower their guard, when anonymous gestures feel normal, and we expect affection, and we don't question where it comes from. So let's explore Valentine's Day urban legends. Ones that we whisper from friend to friend, where love letters arrive without names, phone calls come from impossible places, and romance slowly turns into something much darker. So dim those lights, settle in, and maybe take a second look at the card on your counter, and let's talk spooky. There's a number of urban legends that seem to resurface every February. Usually they're told quietly, like advice rather than a story, whispering warnings such as be careful of anonymous Valentine's Day cards, especially ones that seem to know a bit too much. And our first urban legend really tells what happens when receiving an anonymous card goes from innocent to not. What starts as flattering gestures soon grow more sinister and seem to be more personal than one might want. The sender may begin mentioning clothing that you're wearing, schedules, small details that no stranger should know. And by the time the final card arrives, they're not gentle admirations. It starts to feel like an obsession. In darker versions of this legend, the final card predicts a heartbreaking end. No matter how it's told, the message of the legend is always the same. If someone can reach you anonymously, they're already too close. Stories like this don't come from nowhere either. Valentine's Day has a long history of normalizing anonymity. For centuries, unsigned Valentines were common. In Victorian era, people regularly sent cards without names. Sometimes they're playful, sometimes they were cruel. Newspapers in the late 1800s warned readers about what they called malicious Valentines. Anonymous notes to embarrass, threaten, or unsettle the recipient. As cities grew and people lived closer together, anonymity became easier and more dangerous. It allowed individuals to blend into society undetected. It was simple, but unnerving. Someone could observe you, your routines, just by simply sharing your space. Someone could learn your habits without ever introducing themselves. And by the mid-20th century, especially in North America and the UK, warning stories began to circulate from a friend to a friend tales about cards that crossed the line, admirers who weren't admirers at all, and affection that turned into fixation. These stories were rarely tied to a single documented case, but all of them reflect a very real anxiety that romance could be used as an excuse to watch, follow, and have access to someone. And that's why these legends persist. They're not just about masked killers or supernatural forces. They're about proximity, about the fear that someone knows you because they've been paying attention for longer than you've realized. Urban legends like this function as social warnings. They teach boundaries, they justify instinct, and they give a fear narrative that takes shape when there isn't always proof to point to. And that's why stories like this don't end with facts. They end with a version of what might happen if someone gets too close. And I have an urban legend for you guys that shows exactly what happens when someone gets a little too close for comfort. The legend begins a few days before Valentine's Day. Sutton found a card on her windshield after work. There was no envelope, no stamp, just a cheap, glittery Valentine's Day card, the kind that you would purchase from anywhere. Confused but intrigued, she opened the card, and inside it read 3 words: "Thinking of you." There was no name and no indication of who sent it, just this quick note. She brushed it off as a cute gesture, maybe from a work colleague, and went about her day. 2 days later, another card appeared, but this time it wasn't at work. It was at her apartment doorstep. "You looked nice today," it read. But how? She thought, looking around the front of her building, this time a little bit more uneased, but thinking maybe it was likely a friend being a jerk, and she closed the door and the thought left her mind, and her day resumed. The third card was waiting inside her mailbox the next night after work. "I like the blue jacket." She had worn a blue jacket that day at work, so maybe it was someone she worked with just messing with her. But just 3 days before Valentine's Day, things took a darker turn, and the cards began to arrive much more frequently. They were never mailed, they were never signed by anybody, but they always held an unnerving knowledge. There was one on her car, one on her front door tucked between the screen and the frame, and each time the message would change. "You seem tired today. You didn't smile as much as you used to. You should check that your doors are locked at night." That one made her go cold. That night she struggled to fall asleep, listening to every sound, getting up again and again to check her doors were locked and her windows. And then Valentine's arrived. No card in the morning, no card in the afternoon, and she almost laughed to herself, thinking, yep, it was definitely a prank, a stupid prank. Then that night, when she returned home from work, she saw, set on her dining room table, was a single red envelope. Without even looking at it, she turned and left. She stayed somewhere else that night, telling herself that maybe she was overreacting, but not understanding how the card got inside her apartment. That night, though, she couldn't sleep. She sat up waiting, thinking whoever had sent the cards would find her, but nothing happened. The next day, she returned home with a friend, and there was no broken windows, no forced entry, but one thing stood out All the cards that she had piled on the kitchen table were gone. Every single one, except the very first one. The glittery one. The one that had only said, "I'm thinking of you." But this time, inside, written in darker ink than before, just below the first, said, "I was always watching." No one ever proved who it was, no one was ever caught, and the story ends pretty quietly. But that's why it lingers, because nothing dramatic happened, just the realization that someone had been close enough to watch, patient enough to wait. And it gives you a sense of vulnerability when someone is in your space without you knowing. This urban legend was also the inspiration for a popular 2000s Valentine's Day horror movie called Valentine. And if you haven't seen it, it's a good one. The second urban legend I want to talk about tonight is one that I think you might recognize because there's multiple versions of this one told, depending on how and what fits. And it fits because it's so adaptable. There's a reason that so many urban legends take place on Lover's Lane. The story changes depending on who's telling it, but the setting never usually does. It's usually a quiet road, a parked car, a night meant for closeness. And when the legend resurfaces around Valentine's Day, it takes an extra edge, because the danger isn't always what's outside the car. Sometimes it's who's in it with you. Now, the locations are generally depending on where you live. They're not usually marked on a map, but they're just kind of an understood location. It's a stretch of road that's past the streetlights, up a gravel clearing. Maybe it's by a river. I'm sure you're all imagining a place right now that you may be familiar with. No judgment here. It's a place where the headlights tend to disappear into the trees. And for decades, the dangers of those stories came from outside the vehicle. An escaped convict, a man with a hook, footsteps in the darkness. But by the late 20th century, quieter versions of this began to circulate in high schools around North America. They rarely made it to the newspapers, but they spread through whispers of students. In most of the new versions, the threat wasn't outside the vehicle. It was the one who was driving it. The story typically began in the same way. A young couple parks in an isolated area on Valentine's Day night. There's tension, sometimes an argument, and the girl decides she wants to leave, but the boy insists that they stay. Sometimes there's a radio broadcast that says, "Warning, escaped convict. Authorities advise residents to avoid secluded roads." And the warning sometimes heightens the unease, but sometimes there's no telling at all. But sometimes there's never a broadcast. Sometimes it's something he fabricated, a story meant to frighten her to compliance, to keep her inside the car. The actual danger, you see, was never in the woods. But what distinguishes these versions from the classic Hookman legend is not the gore, it's the control. It's the doors are locked, the engine is running, and because you're in an isolated place, there tends to be no cell phone service. The isolation is psychological as much as it's physical. In interviews collected by folklorists in the 1980s, a similar narrative appeared in regions of the country with only minor changes attached. Sometimes the girls escaped, and sometimes they didn't. These details only shifted, but the structure always remained the same. A young woman realizes slowly, that the person who she's alone with might not be who she thought they were. And unlike the Hookman legends, which reinforce stranger fear, these versions reflect something a little bit more uncomfortable: the risk of intimate threat. It emerges at a time when public conversation around dating violence was becoming much more visible. Hotlines were forming, schools were beginning to address consent, and as folklore does, it changed accordingly. The monster moved from the tree line into the driver's seat of assaults that were staged to resemble outside attacks. In several police reports of the 1970s and 80s, isolated parking areas were more likely the site of domestic or dating violence than any other areas. And legends mirror that reality. In most oral versions of this story, the ending is restrained. The girl is generally found walking along the highway, the car discovered abandoned, and the boy claims it's all a big misunderstanding. Authorities list it as a simple dispute. Nothing supernatural occurs, and yet the unease lingers, because the real horror of Lover's Lane was never the hook scraping against the metal. It was the moment someone realized the locked door isn't meant to keep the danger out. It was meant to keep someone in. Our final Valentine's Day urban legend is that of the Valentine's Day mines. In industrial towns near Nova Scotia and Appalachia, February is statistically one of the most dangerous months underground. Cold temperatures cause rock contraction, as well as water seepage, freezing, and expanding. Timber supports dry and crack, and mines that are already slightly unstable become much less predictable. And because Valentine's Day falls in mid-February, it's not surprising that the Day of Love is attached to such scary seasonal risk. In mining culture, it's always highly superstitious, and scholars of occupational folklore note that miners tend to avoid certain phrases underground. They discourage whistling, and they refuse to speak the names of the people who have died in previous collapses. Over time, symbolic dates layer into tragedy, and it breeds urban legends. By the 1970s and 80s, public discussion of domestic tension, jealousy, and violence became much more visible in mainstream media. The idea of a Valentine rivalry underground became the main circulation for oral tradition. And in 1981, the Canadian film My Bloody Valentine, set in a fictional Nova Scotia mining town, solidified this as a symbolic pairing of popular imagination and pop culture. After the film was released, reports of Valentine mine lights, tapping sounds, and overall increased activity was incorporated into local lore. Not because the event ever truly happened, because it didn't, but because the fiction gave communities a language for something they had already carried with them: the idea of loss and love. Miners working in February would frequently claim to hear tapping in sealed corridors, a single miner's light flickering in areas of the mine where no one was scheduled to be working. In some stories, a figure is seen at the far end of the tunnel, helmet glowing, before disappearing behind a support beam that leads nowhere. And the sightings began to happen most frequently on February 14th. But what's interesting is how the communities sometimes absorb fiction back into oral storytelling, as if the popular fiction movie somehow woke a narrative that connected an already fragile time underground. An older miner in Glace Bay reported to a journalist in the 1980s that you don't joke about Valentine's Day underground. It's a bad day to tempt the rocks. Now, before we end tonight's episode, I want to share a story that is local, and it's that of love, loss, and of course, a ghost. Tucked along the edge of the Niagara Escarpment, Ancaster, Ontario carries a quiet layering of Upper Canadian settlements, stone foundations beneath modern homes, concession roads that still follow colonial survey lines, farmlands that once held barns, long since collapsed or rebuilt. And like many rural communities with deep roots, Ancaster has its own Lover's Lane. The exact location depends on who you're asking. Some describe it as a narrow stretch near the crossroads outside of the town limits. Others point towards older farm roads where the trees have closed in and streetlights thin out. It isn't officially marked, and it has no plaque. It exists because teenagers drove there for decades, and because isolation was part of the appeal. The legend attached to this road, though, is simple. There was a young man. In most oral versions, his name was William Black, and in others, he remains unnamed. The details shift slightly depending on the teller, but the structure is pretty consistent. He fell in love with a woman whose family disapproved. Class differences, reputation, expectations, the reasons vary, but the outcome doesn't. He was forbidden to marry her, and his despair led him to a nearby barn on farm land. And there, he took his own life. The specifics aren't clear, just the aftermath is. A body discovered at dawn, a community shaken. There is no clear archive recorded tying the name William Black to a documented Valentine's Day era suicide, but the absence of documents aren't unusual in rural folklore. For generations, specific names often attach themselves to otherwise undocumented tragedies. What endures is not the paperwork, but it's the road. Because you see, drivers who pass that stretch late at night, particularly in the winter, when the air carries sound differently, report something strange. A low, uneven sound from the roadside. Not a scream, not a shout, but a sob. Some say it comes from the field beyond the ditch. Others insist it's much closer, as if it's just beyond the edge of the headlights. A few have even described seeing a figure standing near the shoulder, a young man in dark clothing, head lowered and unmoving. When the headlights fully illuminate the spot, though, there's nothing there. Unlike more elaborate roadside ghost stories, this one does not include pursuit. The car isn't chased, the driver isn't warned, there's no bloody handprint on the hood. There's only interpretation, a sense that you have driven past something incredibly sad. Local variations suggest sightings increase around Valentine's Day. Now, whether this is a coincidence, suggestion, or simply seasonal psychology, that's up for you to decide. Because February nights are long and the sound does travel over frozen ground differently. Roads tend to be emptier, and the night just seems quieter. But Valentine's Day carries a symbolic weight, a date devoted to romance, to layering of love, and stories that have been denied love create a narrative that seems to gravitate. What makes Ancaster Lover Lane legend endure is not revenge or curse or warnings. It's the idea that grief is so anchored into the geography, a place where promises were imagined, a place where someone realizes those promises could never be kept. And if you drive slowly enough with the radio off and the windows cracked slightly against the cold, some say you'll hear the steady breathing and crying of William Black. And that's all I have for you guys tonight. So whether you're celebrating, whether you're avoiding it entirely, or you're just here for the folklore, I appreciate you tuning into this bonus episode and exploring the strange side of Valentine's Day that usually gets covered in hearts and pink and red. As always, these stories remind us that every tradition has layers, whether it's history, superstition, or the way communities shape meaning. If you've enjoyed tonight's episode, be sure to like and follow this podcast because it helps us grow and it helps other spookies find our community. And share it with someone who has a little love for some haunting history. As always, stay curious and stay spooky.